The mainstream media has been reporting on chaos, fires, looting, protests, and violence for decades. Is this all spontaneous? What's really behind this unrest? This is Anarchy in America with Christian Gomez. Anarchy is becoming all too common. Back in the 1960s, the John Birch Society produced a film called Anarchy USA. It began with the breakdown of law and order, a chaotic reign of terror, mob rule, and rioting, the collapse of government authority. Compare that to the summer of 2020. Recall the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone, CHAZ, in Seattle, later renamed CHOP for Capitol Hill Occupied Protest or the Capitol Hill Organized Protest. On June 16, 2020, officers of the SPD, Seattle Police Department, withdrew from their East Precinct building and the surrounding area. Shortly thereafter, self-proclaimed anarchists, socialists, and communists overran and occupied the area in the name of Black Lives Matter over the police-related death of George Floyd in Minneapolis. Anarchist revolutionaries defiled and vandalized the East Precinct building, renaming it the Seattle People's Department East Precinct. Almost overnight, since May 2020, anarchy has descended upon America's cities and towns. But why is this happening? Are these really spontaneous, peaceful protests as the mainstream media reports, or is something more at work? According to Joseph Stalin, he wrote, "The weaknesses of the capitalist world which we can use are its insuperable antagonisms which dominate the whole international situation." In other words, Stalin was talking about the need of pinpointing and targeting any areas of differences within free, competitive, capitalist countries such as the United States. For the communists and socialists in America, the two main areas identified and targeted to ensure violent revolution was first, economic class warfare, by pitting the working class, such as factory workers, miners, and railroad track workers, against the bosses, factory owners, mine owners, and railroad owners. Penetrating and hijacking the labor movement in America, communists and socialists were able to incite violent strikes and riots in the late 19th century into the 20th century, culminating in 1913 with the progressive movement and policies that expanded the size and scope of the federal government, such as the creation of the Department of Labor and Secretary of Labor as a cabinet-level position. There was also the ratification of the 16th Amendment. The 16th Amendment not only made it possible for the federal government to legally levy income taxes, but also to institute a progressive income tax in order to redistribute wealth by increasing surtaxes on those who earn higher incomes. It is always the goal of socialists and communists to further grow and empower the federal or national government. The second area identified and targeted to ensure violent revolution was race, convincing Black Americans that they are the victims of brutality and oppression. The goal is to create the need for liberation and self-determination. Today we see organizations such as Black Lives Matter claiming to be fighting on behalf of the continued plight of Black Americans. In the name of Black Lives Matter, we've seen our cities devolve into sites of anarchy, lawlessness, protests, fires, looting, violence, demands to defund and abolish the police, and open calls for revolution. Now, much of the mainstream left in America, including prominent liberal think tanks and Democrat politicians, are championing the causes of BLM and communists. The distinction between the mainstream left and Marxism-Leninism is increasingly becoming more blurred. For example, visit and read through the websites of self-avowed Marxist-Leninist organizations in America, such as the Communist Party USA and Freedom Road Socialist Organization. Notice how similar their rhetoric is to that of the mainstream left. In fact, Bob Avakian, the chairman of the Revolutionary Communist Party, a Marxist-Leninist Maoist group, released a statement on their party's website, revcom.us, urging their fellow comrades not to throw away their votes on a protest candidate that stands no chance of winning and to instead vote for Joe Biden, essentially endorsing the Democratic Party presidential nominee. Avakian's statement read, "At this critical hour, every appropriate means of non-violent action must be utilized to remove this regime from power. And if, in spite of mass protests demanding the removal of the Trump-Pence regime, this regime remains in power when it is time for voting, then without placing fundamental reliance on this, using all appropriate means to work for the removal of this regime must include voting against Trump, assuming the election is actually held. To be clear, this means not a protest vote for some candidate who has no chance of winning, but actually voting for the Democratic Party candidate Biden in order to effectively vote against Trump." Don't mistake this to mean that communists have come more to the center. Nothing could be further from the truth. As the communists and Marxists agitate in the streets, applying pressure from below, and after decades of penetration working within the Democratic Party, the so-called mainstream left has instead moved further leftward in the direction of Marxism-Leninism. This is all part of the communist agenda, and this is nothing new. In 1965, our film strip, Anarchy USA, traced the methods used by communists to take over China, Cuba, and Algeria, and then parallel those same methods to the civil rights movement in the United States. As originally outlined in Anarchy USA, the 5 steps are: divide the people, create appearance of popular support, neutralize the opposition, precipitate mob violence, and create semblance of revolution. Throughout this series, we will cover current events as well as decades worth of communist history that relate to their tactics pushing the communist agenda today. Our next 5 episodes will cover the very 5 tactics that were outlined in Anarchy USA. First, in Divide the People, our special guests, Dr. Carlos Casanova and Leah Southwell, will examine how communists and Marxists divide the people by briefly looking at how they did so in Cuba and Venezuela, and for over the last year in Chile, where the country has been ravaged by protests and violent clashes with the police instigated by the country's socialist and communist parties, which are now demanding for a new constitution for Chile. They conclude by relating what's happening in Chile to what's happening here in America.
Marx already in the Communist Manifesto and in other works says that you have to find any division to sow like internal strife. The Chilean case is very interesting and important for the US because what they are doing here is causing a racial divide.
And I found the loudest agitator and went in front of him and said, "What do you think you're going to accomplish by burning down your own city?" And he said, "You don't understand, lady." And I said, what don't I understand? He said, "This is a revolution. We need to burn it down before we can rebuild it."
Next is create the appearance of popular support. Special guest Jesse Lee Peterson joins us to discuss how many of our country's prominent black leaders create the appearance of popular support within the black community while advancing a Marxist agenda.
Well, number one is to gain power and wealth for themselves. And number 2 is to turn America into a socialist communist society. Because if you look at it, they have been in charge of the so-called black people for a long time now. Jesse Jackson and others get rich off the confusion between the blacks and the whites. They want you separated so that you don't get to know what's really going on or pay attention. Divide and conquer is what this is all about.
In Neutralizing the Opposition, we will hear from anti-communist author and filmmaker Trevor Loudon. He examines how communists and Marxists are penetrating our Judeo-Christian institutions, such as churches, seminaries, and Bible colleges, in order to neutralize the opposition, After all, what's a greater opposition to the godless atheism of Marxism-Leninism than the churches?
The Communist Party USA has a religious commission for putting communists into religious institutions.
Wow.
The Democratic Socialists of America has a religious commission for doing the same thing. The League of Revolutionaries for a New America, which used to be called the Communist Labor Party, also has several clergymen on its rolls, Baptist pastors, Episcopalians. The denomination isn't so important because they don't really care about the denomination. It's just getting into the churches, getting the church's money, and getting the church's audience and influence.
Then we have Precipitate Mob Violence. Former CEO of the John Birch Society, Arthur Thompson, discusses how and why communists precipitate mob violence in the streets. He recalls the tactics used during the height of the 1960s civil rights movement when he was in charge of the Support Your Local Police Committees in Seattle, Washington.
Well, they did any number of things. They actually had two basic tactics they used. One was to intimidate people, to agitate them into violence. In other words, they could stand back after what they had done, and the white folk or whatever would attack them. The police would attack them for doing things that were illegal, belligerent, that sort of thing. They themselves never got involved in violence. The Martin Luther Kings, the John Lewises, they never got involved in violence, but they provoked violence on the other side to create that image of we're just peaceful folks. On the other hand, you had the militant groups, the Black Panthers and those sorts, who actually did promote violence. They would start fires, for instance, and they would have snipers at these fires for the first responders, that when they would come, usually the firemen, they would start shooting at them.
And finally, create the semblance of revolution. Anti-communist expert, author, and senior editor of The New American, William F. Jasper, joins us to discuss how communists are actually behind Black Lives Matter, Antifa, and the protests engulfing America's cities. Looking at both history and modern examples from around the world, Anarchy in America will delve deep to unmask the organization and aims of the current anarchy unfolding before our very eyes, in the evening news and in our cities. You won't want to miss what we've got in store for you. Until next week's episode, this is Christian Gomez. Thank you for watching, and God bless.